Steel breath breathes under floodlights. You stand at a railing above a midnight port, cranes moving like patient animals, hoisting boxes that clink and groan, each a sealed story with a schedule and a price. Salt rides the wind from the roadstead. Below, a pilot boat noses along a hull, a tiny torch of authority in a sea of dark. Somewhere farther out, a cable-laying vessel inches across the chart like a pen on vellum, unspooling a glass thread that will carry laughter, orders, and fear. And far from the water, in a quiet London room, a clerk drags a nib across an insurance ledger and decides what a storm will cost you. You feel the rhythm before you see it. A box lands. A hinge snaps. A number changes. That's power, not shouted from a palace balcony, but spoken in the cool of a counting room. Payable upon safe arrival, subject to general average, arbitration in London. You don't need to fly a flag over a city if you sign the clause that city lives by. You don't need a garrison if the harbor master reads your handbook and the bank clears your letter of credit. Empire can be a sailor's superstition or a lawyer's paragraph. It leaves no anthem, it leaves paperwork. Here's your line in the sand. In December 1931, the Statute of Westminster recognizes the legislative independence of Britain's dominions. Empire loosens at the joints without quite falling. Almost a quarter century later, in late 1956, the Suez Crisis will expose a weakness you can smell like ozone after lightning. When you move without consent, the world can seize your hand. Between those two dates, between paper independence and public humiliation, lies a narrow channel where a different choice could have been made. Not soil, standards. You feel the argument in your chest as the ship's horn rolls across the water. Sea trade concentrates power because the world's heavy things refuse to move any other way. Grain, oil, ore, the cheap miracles you expect at sunrise. Someone must guarantee their voyage. That someone writes rules, prices risk, and draws red pencil lines around danger. Lloyd's of London began as a cluster of underwriters in a coffeehouse by the Thames in the late 17th century. Edward Lloyd's place was operating by 1688. Men with pens and ledgers and nerves. They did not conquer, they calculated. If your keel cut wake in salt water, they would measure your fate in premiums and claims. A storm becomes a number. Piracy becomes a rider. A war becomes an exclusion clause and neat script. This is what ruling the rules feels like when you press two fingers to its pulse. You know the freight world turned on a hinge in the spring of 1956 when the converted tanker Ideal X sailed with a deck of standardized containers from New Jersey to Houston. A box the same width here as there, the same lock, the same twist, the same crane. Every future port would either kneel to the geometry or lose its life to ports that did. Standardization gave speed its spine and cost its ceiling, and in those same years, another quiet current moved through the City of London. Dollars pooling outside America in the Eurodollar market, pricing global appetite through London's clocks and London's appetite for risk. This is not a drumbeat you hear. It's a hum you notice when it stops. Come closer. Listen to the legal ink. Common law travels on habit and precedent, like a sea lane does. It favors enforceable promises over grand designs. If your bills of lading bind you to arbitration in London, if your marine policy names a London syndicate, if your contract reads English law, you've consented to a soft occupation of the mind. The statute book becomes a map, and the map becomes your diet. You are ruled, but you ask to be, because the ships move faster when the forms match the cranes. You carry the ghosts of money in your pocket. The sterling area once aligned currencies with the pound, a web of preference that made the world tilt toward London. Bretton Woods after 1944 redrew the sky. The dollar brightened, the pound dimmed. War debts added weight to a tired spine. You don't have to invent numbers to feel that strain. It shows up in ration books, in thin defense budgets, in quiet resignations scrawled in the margins of Whitehall memos. And yet, in the same breath, the mind of empire adapts. Do not guard land, guard lanes. Do not crown kings, crown standards. You let your eyes search the port. A man in a hard hat signals. A container lifts. It has become impossible to imagine a world without these silent bricks of civilization, each stamped with a code. The code unlocks insurance. Insurance unlocks credit. Credit unlocks the voyage. And behind them, all stands a practice older than iron holes, an underwriter who will say yes or no, and a court that will enforce the promise without asking who sang what anthem at the Harbor Festival. It is prosaic. That's why it works. If you want to understand how a nation could still rule the world without ruling it, you stand where you are now and watch the boxes fall into place like careful dominoes. You look past the cranes to the map in your head. Gibraltar, Suez, Bab, el-Mandeb, Hormuz, Malacca, Singapore. Choke points like knuckles on a fist that never needs to close. You feel the salt in the air, and you think about cables under your feet, glass hair carrying confessions and trades. You imagine the ledger in London as a heart, each premium a beat, each claim a sigh. Before we go deeper, hold the present between your fingers. You live inside these rules already. When your parcel moves, a clause moves it. When you stream a voice across the night, a contract keeps it whole. If this way of seeing the world is a machine of standards humming in salt wind, speaks to you, listen with us more often. What If Wars is a vessel. Subscribe, come deeper into the chart room, and learn where the currents pinch and why. Now draw the channel again. 1931 on one headland, 1956 on the other. On this page, the empire faces two futures. In one, it answers humiliation with nostalgia and fades heavy with flags. In the other, it answers with precision. Write the contracts, own the arbitration, ensure the voyage, train the harbor masters, wire the cables, and let the flags go. It chooses the sound of a pen over the clatter of a parade ground. It chooses to rule the rules before Suez breaks. That decision, made in ink and silence, is the door we walk through next. You hear the canal before you see it, low water slapping concrete, a trumpet on a radio somewhere in Arabic. July 26, 1956. Gamal Abdel Nasser steps to a microphone in Alexandria and nationalizes the Suez Canal Company. Your stomach drops, not because a waterway changed owners, but because a promise did. Insurance calculations ripple. Sterling balances flinch. In Downing Street, Anthony Eden hardens his jaw. In Washington, the phone lines hiss. The canal was never just a ditch. It was a contract pinned to a map. You move to autumn. October 29th, Israeli armor rolls into Sinai. October 31st, Anglo-French aircraft strike Egyptian airfields. You can taste the cordite in the air even now, but the decisive smell is different. Ozone after a lightning strike on a balance sheet. Dollars. Under Bretton Woods, the pound lives under a gold-pegged sky, and your foreign exchange reserves are a weather report. As markets punish sterling, as the United States hints it might withhold IMF support and sell pounds, you feel the room tilt. November 6th, the order to stop. A ceasefire that tastes like copper on your tongue. Eden will resign in January 1957. You don't need to invent numbers. You remember the two that stung earlier in the decade and later on. $4.03 to $2.80 in 1949, then to $2.40 in 1967. Devaluation is humiliation you carry in your coat pocket. Bretton Woods itself was a bargain written in 1944 under wartime shadows. The dollar at $35 per ounce of gold, fixed exchange rates. The IMF and World Bank as guardians of an order that promised stability and demanded discipline. For you, discipline means rationing ambition. It means the sterling area. Once a web of currencies, preferences, and clearing arrangements, tightening, then fraying. The 1947 convertibility crisis announces that you cannot be everywhere at once. Not with a homeland to rebuild, and Commonwealth friends impatient for dignity. Imperial preference collides with GATT's non-discrimination. The old habit of send orders, receive obedience, hits the brick wall of the United Nations, where words like self-determination stop being slogans and start being votes. You sit with a ledger in the city and watch another tide form. Late 1950s into the 1960s, dollars begin to pool offshore. Soviet and Eastern European entities hold greenbacks where American jurisdiction can't easily squeeze them. European banks discovered they can accept and relend those dollars at speed. London moves like a fox through a hedge. Light touch, long hours, a language the world already uses. The Eurodollar market isn't bombastic. It is patient and hungry. Washington passes the interest equalization tax in 1963, nudging more business to your desks. By the end of the decade, you are no longer the empire of goods. You are the hallway where money accelerates. You reach backward for the quiet signature that made this possible. The UCUSA Agreement of 1946, Five Eyes, knit signals into advantage. GCHQ in Cheltenham, NSA at Fort Meade, partners in Ottawa, Canberra, Wellington. A listening architecture that trades in warnings, access, and favors. Intelligence doesn't rule. It brokers consent. A well-timed intercept gives you a bargaining chip in rooms where law is being drafted and standards are being set. You do not trumpet it. You turn down the volume and let the hum of shared secrets shape the room. Now, put your finger on the map at Suez again and ask the real question. If you cannot afford to be obeyed, can you afford to be indispensable? That is the pivot Suez forces. In this telling, you walk out of 1956 with blood in your mouth and a surgeon's clarity. You choose prestige you can bank rather than prestige you can parade. You sit with Washington and say, co-lead the sea with us. Not the ships, the rules. The International Maritime Organization, born from a 1948 convention, entering into force in 1958, becomes a workshop, and you bring the tools, precedent, barristers, the discipline of Lloyd's marine clauses, the old York-Antwerp logic of general average refined in plain English. You give up unilateral heroics and demand, in return, a seat that cannot be pulled out from under you. That's the price of survival. You codify arbitration routes through London and make them habits. Bills of lading and charter parties name English law, not because you shout louder, but because cargo moves faster when the clauses are predictable. The London Maritime Arbitrators Association takes shape in the new decade. The habit of calling a silk in the Temple or a name in Lime Street becomes muscle memory for ship owners in Piraeus, insurers in New York, traders in Singapore. You win not by saying mine, but by making ours sound like you. Feel the pattern interrupt. 1931, Statute of Westminster, Dominion autonomy. 1944, Bretton Woods, dollar ascendant. 1956, Suez, a public lesson. 1960s, Eurodollars, an invisible empire slipping into your hands. Each date is a buoy on your channel, and you steer between them by swapping land for law, banners for boilerplate. And every time a minister asks for adventure, you lay down the arithmetic. Defense pounds or welfare pounds, debt service or dock cranes, a destroyer at Aden, or a standard everyone must sign to use Suez without drama. Sovereignty becomes a series of questions with an answer you can audit. You also swallow what pride demands you spit out. Unilateralism is off the table. No more secret protocols and midnight coalitions built on old habits. You stop expecting gratitude and start charging fees. You accept that decolonization is not a tragedy to be reversed, but a fact to be ensured. Your Navy trains for escorts and inspections, not crusades. Your diplomats arrive with model clauses and draft language on maritime safety, port state control, and limitation of liability. The theater is smaller, the reach is longer, and you make it personal. A ship owner in Tokyo signs a New York produce exchange charter, but names English law and London arbitration because his banker smiles when he does. A refinery in the Gulf adds a rider based on a war risk rate quoted on Lime Street. A port authority in West Africa adopts a safety code word for word from an IMO circular you wrote a paragraph of. None of them thinks of you when a crane locks onto a twist, when a stevedore whistles, when a manifest prints. But the shape of their day was written at your desk. So here is the quiet, consequential what if that grows from humiliation rather than from nostalgia. After Suez, you do not double down on occupying places. You double down on occupying processes. You tell the United States, we will be your partner in the boring work that makes oceans behave. In return, you want and get the right to draft, to arbitrate, to insure. You lose the banner and keep the stamp. By the time a steel box becomes the global unit of motion in 1956, you have already chosen to make the locks, not the keys. When the first stacks sail and ports begin to compete on cranes and clearances, your clauses will be waiting. And as the boxes draw lines from Gibraltar to Suez, to Bab el-Mandeb, to Hormuz, to Malacca, to Singapore, you will sit in London and price the weather, not the rain, the risk. You watch a box leave the earth. The crane breathes, the twist lock snaps, and suddenly a metal room becomes a unit of time. You know the hinge date because the industry won't stop repeating it. April 1956. The Ideal X sails with standardized containers bolted to her deck and a quiet revolution under her paint. A shape becomes a promise. A 20-foot length that will still be a 20-foot length when the fog lifts in some other hemisphere. By 1968, ISO 668 nails the dimensions into law-like habit, 20 and 40 as the bones of motion. Ports that accept those bones thrive. Ports that don't are museums with fresh seagulls. You stand where maps turn into muscle. Gibraltar is a door, Suez a throat, Bab el-Mandeb a breath, Hormuz a pulse, Malacca a nerve, Singapore the synapse where east meets hum. In 1967, the Suez Canal closes, barred by war, and the world learns what it costs to route around a scar. In 1975, it reopens, and every shipmaster relearns the relief of the straight line. You don't need to invent a figure to feel what those 8 years did to fuel, to schedules, to nerves. You felt it in bills of lading that grew extra pages. You saw it in premiums that rose with the heat. Now you drop a finger on the Strait of Malacca, where the Andaman Sea squeezes into the South China Sea and the tide holds its breath. It's night. A convoy of container ships edges into the lane, decks stacked like cities. On Lime Street in London, an underwriter reads the tape, piracy reports from the archipelago, a cable from a correspondent in Singapore, a note about a skiff sighted at dusk, and adjusts a line in the war risks section. One notch, a single point made with a pen. In the wheelhouse, a captain rolls throttle to keep time with the pilot's voice. In a bank server room, a letter of credit goes from pending to live, because the risk now wears a price that a board can accept. You never meet the underwriter. You live by his mark. You chart the ports that learn to love the box. Singapore turns an island's geometry into leverage. In 1972, the Tanjong Pagar container terminal opens. Cranes multiply like decision trees. Tugboats become punctuation in a language that money understands. Hong Kong's Kwai Chung container port comes online the same year, and the colony's rocky slopes suddenly converse in steel syllables with California, with Rotterdam, with Kaohsiung. Both places live under British law in these decades. One a city-state that prefers efficiency to sleep. The other a crown colony that refines speed into a civic habit. And both fold London into every move they make without asking permission. They standardize. They arbitrate in English. They call your insurers when a hatch bangs wrong. The empire you were told had ended shows up anyway in the paperwork. You listen for another pulse under the diesel. The London market turns risk into liquidity. Lloyd's does not announce itself with brass. It ticks with binders and stamps. Marine policies adopt clauses that feel like commandments because they travel well, because they were written by people who have argued about ships longer than most nations have existed. Institute cargo clauses drafted in that city become the DNA of global trade, defining when all risks means all the risks a judge in the Strand will recognize. Banks price letters of credit against those clauses, and a chain forms from a pen in London to a forklift in Lagos to a shelf in your kitchen. You never see the chain, you eat it. Now you move along the knuckles of power and name them so you don't forget. Gibraltar, a rock with a tunnel and a runway, the gate to an inland sea. Suez, a trench cut through politics and salt, the difference between weeks and days. Bab el-Mandeb, a wind that knows how to become a headline. Hormuz, a narrow argument between coasts that learn to mean oil. Malacca, a long, shallow whisper where pirates and pilots hear each other's engines before they see each other's eyes. Singapore, The island that turned those whispers into an orchestra and made the first chair section leader the law. You pull back to the 1980s and taste metal. The tanker war in the Gulf makes insurance language quiver. Additional war risk premiums, exclusion zones, convoy clauses that sound like old history rediscovered. The Strait of Hormuz becomes a math problem on someone's desk in EC3. You don't need a cannon to change a voyage. You need a signature. A refinery delays purchase by 48 hours. A ship owner insists on a surcharge. An underwriter draws a tiny ship with a pen and writes, "Approved if escorted." Weeks later, the news calls it policy. It was already practice. Singapore and Hong Kong aren't just ports in this era. They are classrooms where British habit becomes Asian strength. Judges in both places build reputations for speed and clarity in commercial disputes. Arbitrators learn to see through fogs of invoices to the beating heart of a contract. If you carry a box there and it leaks or burns, if a crane drops it like a careless word, you already know which courtroom or conference room will decide whose haze. That predictability, the way it cools hands that want to shake, becomes a form of sovereignty more persuasive than a line of soldiers at a custom shed. You show yourself a small miracle that feels ordinary because it happens every hour. A refrigerated container leaves a farm and arrives 3 weeks later with strawberries that taste like a risky promise honored. The reason they did not spoil sits in a file, a maintenance schedule, a liability limit, a repair clause that names who pays when a compressor fails between Aden and Djibouti. London wrote that grammar. Singapore spoke it fluently. A captain applied it at 3 a.m. with a flashlight in his teeth. You eat the fruit and think the world is simple. It is not. It is exquisitely administered. You also remember that standards are teeth, not just smiles. When a port fails an inspection under a code you helped draft, ships go elsewhere. When a flag of convenience lets standards slip, insurers frown, and premiums rise until a flag becomes expensive to fly. The language is never obey. It is comply or pay. And you learn that most things in the world prefer to comply when time matters and margins are thin. Here is the what-if that makes this era not just a chronicle, but a lever. You convince Commonwealth ports and carriers, Singapore, Hong Kong before 1997, colleagues in South Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean, to form a cartel not of prices but of paperwork. You do not fix rates, you fix expectations. You agree on inspection regimes, on clauses that bind disputes to London or its common law partners, on training that turns dockside intuition into documented practice. You make the standards so attractive that shippers who want speed and predictability opt in. And by opting in, they accept your jurisdiction without a speech. A cartel of form, not fees. The market calls it efficiency. You call it reach. So, a box leaves a pier in a night that smells like brine and hot steel. A captain checks his route past Gibraltar, through a reopened Suez, down the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb, across the Gulf of Aden under the eye of Hormuz's quarrels, threading Malacca to the bright grid of Singapore. At every pinch point, a price flickers in London and a paragraph waits to be invoked if the sea remembers it is older than you. The world moves because those two invisible things, price and paragraph, move first. And in this telling, you made them. Dawn lifts with a dull thrum through the hull of a cable ship. You feel the sea as a weight, then as a wire. A drum turns, armored fiber slips over the stern in a shining line, not thicker than your thumb, yet heavy with voices. Somewhere up the beach in Cornwall, concrete huts face the Atlantic and wait for landings that look like nothing, just a black hose in the surf, just a gull and a wave, and yet they change how nations breathe. You live inside that quiet. You make calls that cross winters and wars, because glass holds light the way a keel holds course. You remember an earlier lesson in distance, April 2nd, 1982. Argentine troops land on the Falklands. June 14th, British forces retake Stanley. 74 days between shock and return. You can still hear the knife-edge cold on the South Atlantic airstrip, the slow courage of a task force sent to the horizon, because London insisted it mattered. Expeditionary reach is not a trophy. It's an argument you can make later without shouting. When you tell ship owners and cable consortia that you can protect what matters if you must, they believe you. Deterrence becomes a paragraph in a procurement plan. Insurance prices fall into line. By the 1990s, the seabed becomes a ledger. The old copper telegraphy had already given way to glass. A hinge year you cannot forget is 1988, when Tieta-8 carries digitized breath between continents, and a new logic arrives, bandwidth as cargo. In 1997, Flag's Europe-Asia line draws a hard, bright arc. In 1999, See Me We 3 stitches Singapore to the Middle East and on to Western Europe. You don't need percentages to know the truth. The overwhelming majority of international data rides the ocean floor. Satellites are useful. Cables are civilization. If the ocean floor is the nervous system, law is the memory that lets it learn. You hear the click of a conference room door in Bishopsgate, in Central, in Raffles Place. A general counsel lays a finger on a clause and chooses a city to be believed in. London's Arbitration Act 1996 turns a Victorian habit into a modern machine. Party autonomy, curial support, limited court interference, enforceability. In Hong Kong, the HKIAC, founded in 1985, becomes a byword for speed. In Singapore, the SIAC, established in 1991, builds a manner of making disputes smaller than the world they once threatened to stop. Pre-commitment becomes a virtue. Cross-border finance, energy, shipping, technology. Contracts carry choice of law, and forum clauses the way ships carry ballast, not for show, but for stability. The old maritime reflex deepens. The Institute cargo clauses are revised again in 2009. Wording you hardly notice governs whether a refrigerated container's failure is someone's fault or someone's burden. The London Maritime Arbitrators Association quietly updates its terms, and the habit holds. If steel meets salt and money changes hands, a forum in English will make sense of the scrape. Common law is not a banner, it is muscle memory. You watch parties from Seoul and Sao Paulo, from Lagos and Limassol, step into rooms in London or Hong Kong or Singapore and argue like old teammates about what words meant on a wet night near Aden. You pivot your gaze back to the seabed. A trawler's anchor drags where it shouldn't. A quake flexes a shelf. A political quarrel turns into a suspicious silence just off a coast, where journalists grope for signal and find none. January 2008, near Alexandria. Multiple cuts, slow traffic across a huge swath of water and land. You learn how vulnerable invisible is. Restoration plans unfold like military campaigns. Permits, ships, weather windows, spare repeaters flown from warehouses where the air tastes like plastic and patience. Insurers in London widen eyes and then narrow them into rates you can live with. Network operators reroute. Latency climbs. Money feels sore in its joints. No one gives a speech. Everyone reads a clause. Security follows where liability leads. Five Eyes, the UQC agreement of 1946 with its errors and updates, was built for secrets in the air, yet the same trust architecture now helps you think about secrets in the sea. The conversation shifts from interception to integrity. How to know a cable is unhurt, how to watch it without scaring it, how to respond without turning a fix into an incident. You talk less about eavesdropping and more about uptime. You talk to navies about routes and guard boxes. You talk to regulators about access and warrants, because legitimacy is freight too, and if you overload it, a cable sags in a courtroom. You keep the law clean so the wire can hum. Alliances change shape around this reality. In 2021, AUKUS puts submarines on the front page, but the deeper story is quieter. Undersea domain awareness, shared technologies for listening and hiding, a promise that the places where light runs in the dark will not be left alone. NATO committees begin to say the words critical seabed infrastructure out loud. Port authorities add patrols. Hydrographic offices update surveys. None of this looks imperial. All of it feels like a covenant. We will keep the lines alive, and in return, we will be allowed to write the rules that keep them safe. You write a micro scene because that's how truth sticks. A cable lands at a beach on an island state that loves order. The landing party lays conduit under a gray morning. A bureaucrat stamps a permit that quotes an environmental clause drafted in London. A contractor signs a warranty that sends disputes to Singapore. A banker opens a facility contingent on an insurance binder that sits on a desk on Lime Street. Years later, a backhoe bites too deep. The screen goes blank for a heartbeat. A hotline rings in 3 time zones at once. An ROV launches. A claim file opens. An arbitral notice is drafted. Within days, your voice is back. Not because someone barked, but because everyone remembered what they had promised and who would hold them to it. You keep the memory of 1982 inside this. When a cable repair ship asks for an escort near waters where a quarrel is fresh, a frigate appears at the edge of the weather. It doesn't fire. It watches. Its existence is punctuation in a sentence that began with, "We will." The South Atlantic taught you the tone. You don't ask to be feared, you arrange to be respected, which in the language of trade means paid attention to when we write. Here is the what if you carry forward with a steady hand. Build a Commonwealth of Cables. Not a monopoly of metal, but a consortium of governance. Shared ownership stakes in the big routes that matter. Training pipelines for cable engineers and master mariners. A standing arrangement for escorts and surveys at choke points. Model clauses that default to London, Singapore, or Hong Kong. Cyber norms agreed in advance for breach disclosure and lawful access. You do not need a switch to turn the world off. You need a calendar to schedule maintenance windows, a registry to log incidents, and a bench of arbitrators who can keep a quarrel from becoming a rupture. De facto veto power arrives not as a threat, but as a habit. If you don't sign, you wait. If you sign, you move. You return to the hull at dawn. The drum turns, the wire sinks. The ship lays a line across a depth your eyes will never see. And yet you feel it, the way a city brightens when a child taps "call" and a grandmother laughs on the other side of the planet. Law held, insurance held, patrols held, the covenant held. If the British Empire still rules the world in this century, it is because you learned to rule the rules where light travels, under the sea, through a clause, across a table where strangers agree to be bound. You wake into an empire that doesn't march. It bills. A push notification blinks. Your card cleared at 2:17. A server room blinked awake. A clause you've never read agreed with another clause you've never seen. And somewhere a machine stamped your name onto a manifest that will outlast your sleep. You live under consent disguised as convenience. The question now isn't whether Britain could still rule the world, but whether you would agree to be ruled this way, by timetables, by standards, by law that travels faster than flags. Legitimacy begins with memory. A museum label mentions indenture and famine. A square in Nairobi or Kolkata erupts in anniversary light. A street in Belfast remembers a different kind of empire altogether. You don't wipe any of it away with a new logo. You address it in minutes, in scholarships, in apologies that name specifics, and then spend money in the right direction. Archives opened, pensions honored, stolen objects returned with ceremony and contracts. Not to buy forgiveness, to buy credibility. Consent doesn't come from speeches. It comes from procedures people can predict, scrutinize, and exit. Inside that discipline, you propose something that looks like a treaty and behaves like software. A Commonwealth Union, voluntary by design, open to any state that wants the benefits and accepts the audits. Weighted voting that mixes population, trade volume, and contribution, so a small port with excellent standards can matter, and a giant market that slacks can't coast. Mobility corridors you can feel in your calendar, youth visas that turn into skills exchanges, mutual recognition for engineers, nurses, maritime officers, scholarship paths that carry you from Accra to Aberdeen and back again without friction. Legal cooperation that shortens the distance between courts, certified service of process, reciprocal enforcement of judgments, a standard for digital evidence. Ports that pass inspections on time get lower insurance rates, faster customs windows, and a bad shippers recognized at a glance. Every benefit is a door with a hinge. Every hinge has a checklist. You pay for this by telling the truth about budgets. Defense pounds or hospital pounds, ships or schools. You keep the hull where it matters. Escorts at choke points, patrols near cables, maritime surveillance that watches with patience instead of swagger. You share the rest. NATO for air corridors, AUKUS for undersea awareness, bilateral pacts that put small coast guards on the same radio net as big navies. You treat deterrence as logistics with a flag on the side, not the other way around. The point is not to be everywhere. The point is, for trouble to know, you can arrive with a repair ship, a frigate, and an arbitration seat before a headline finishes its first paragraph. You weigh yourself against giants without pretending to be taller. With the United States, you co-author the boring parts that decide everything. Safety codes, port state control regimes, sanctions navigation for shipping, and finance that doesn't punish hospitals. With the European Union, you harmonize where it counts. Data adequacy, product standards for green fuels, carbon accounting for ships. So a crate doesn't lose a day at a customs interface. With China, you resist melodrama and insist on math. Co-insure specific corridors, share AIS and weather data for safety. Agree that sabotage to cables is indictable everywhere and excusable nowhere. You aim to profit from everyone's growth by making their routes legal and insurable. You make other powers richer. For a fee. It is not romance. It is an invoice. You also build a stabilizer that suits an island that learned to balance by writing numbers. Not a gold fetish, not a peg you can't honor. A sterling commodity bridge you can walk in a storm. A Bank of England facility that accepts a small basket of visible, traded goods, Brent crude, copper, wheat, as collateral for short-term sterling liquidity to members of the Union. It doesn't fix the world to a rock. It gives ports and shippers a way to breathe when prices pitch. Derivatives clear in London under margin rules everyone has signed. You're not dictating value. You're damping panic. That's what grown-ups do around a table. The other plank is wet, a cable protection treaty that binds ports and platforms like a net. Landing states commit to fast-track clearances for repair ships, to customs lines that know what repeaters look like and why they can't sit in a warehouse waiting for a stamp. Navies agree on escorts within specific boxes sketched over sensitive seabeds. Insurance syndicates pre-fund a pool that opens within hours of a verified cut, so politics can't freeze repairs. Sabotage becomes a universal crime, with model indictments and extradition pathways pinned to it like tags on a suitcase. Contracts default to London, Singapore, or Hong Kong for disputes, and those forums publish anonymized awards, so practices converge without shame. You don't threaten the world with darkness. You promise it a repair time you're willing to be sued over. Consent needs escape hatches to mean anything. Every Commonwealth Union instrument carries review dates and exit clauses. You build an ombudsman with teeth and a mandate to embarrass you in public if your standards become rent-seeking. You fund media training and investigative grants in member states so journalism can do its job when a crane fails or a minister leans too hard on a port director. You keep immigration lines moving for the workers who hold this together and remind voters that a well-run frontier is not a wall but a membrane, selective, documented, humane. You don't pretend the future is clean. Climate turns sea lanes into questions. New fuels rewrite safety manuals older than your grandparents. A ship the size of a suburb can stop a canal with a wrong-angled gust, and the memes will be sharper than your communiques. Big platforms want to write their own rules for speech. Small islands want a bigger cut of transit fees. You treat each as a paperwork problem with a moral center. Transparency for the platforms, green corridors for fuels with audited emissions, contingency plans for canals that don't wither at the first meeting. You do not promise omnipotence. You promise competence and the right to be angry at you when you fail. Now, shrink the globe to a morning. A payment leaves your phone and burrows through a bank in Nairobi, a clearing system in London, and a platform in Dublin. A container of insulin clears at Felixstowe because a customs pre-arrival declaration matched a barcode at a bonded warehouse in Birmingham, and an insurer in EC3 didn't flinch. A student visa flips from pending to granted. A scholarship letter arrives with a digital signature recognized in both Kingston and Manchester. A panel physician scans a form you'll forget by lunch. A barge noses past Gibraltar under a sky that flushed pink without asking you. A cable hums on a continental slope while a shrimp boat trawls above it, ignorant and perfect. You are not being ruled. You are being served and charged and quietly protected in the way that makes citizenship feel like belonging rather than obedience. You kept the costs in view. You tightened the accounts. You made the standards human enough that they could be loved. If the British Empire still rules the world in this telling, it is because you chose not to be an empire. You chose to be the place where friction goes to die and promises go to be enforced. You traded banners for boilerplate. You bet that the world would forgive a pen what it would not forgive a sword. And you were right, because the ship sailed, the call went through, and the bill made sense. You stand again at a railing over midnight water. A crane pauses at the top of its arc. A pilot murmurs, "Steady." Far out, a quiet ship pays out a brighter future, one dark meter at a time. If this way of seeing power, the law in the wind, the price in the wave, the cable under your feet, felt true in your bones, come with us. Subscribe to What If Wars, and let's keep walking the maps that decide your morning before you wake.